My sister insisted that our mom, who's happily remarried and moved on, pretend to be a happy family with our father at her wedding. The same father who made our childhood a living nightmare. Mom refused, knowing she'd either have to play along or be uninvited. So, she chose not to attend. Now, my sister is bombarding my phone with calls because she's in hot water with her in-laws and needs me to cover for her. Christine, my younger sister, just tied the knot with her husband, Jacob, this past week. Normally, you'd think she'd be over the moon, enjoying her honeymoon phase without a care in the world. But instead of basking in the happiness of her new marriage, she's been calling me nonstop for days. Why? Because she gave our mom an ultimatum. Come to the wedding alone or don't come at all. The backstory. Our parents split up when we were still kids, and things have been complicated ever since. To put it bluntly, their marriage was a disaster. They were constantly at each other's throats, fighting over anything and everything. I was born just a year after they got married, so I grew up witnessing the worst of it. The screaming matches, the bitterness, the hostility, it was all too much, even for a child. By the time Christine was born years later, I had already been exposed to more dysfunction than any kid should ever experience. But for her, it was even scarier. As the youngest, she wasn't just aware of the tension, she was terrified of it. The shouting, the slammed doors, the looming fear of what might happen next. I had grown somewhat numb to the chaos, but Christine? She was just a little girl who didn't understand why home felt so unsafe. As her older sibling, I saw it as my job to protect her, even though I was still just a child myself. I'd do whatever I could to shield her from our parents' fights, distracting her with games, telling her stories, holding her close when she got too scared. I remember whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure if it ever would be. This part of my life isn't something I like to talk about. It's painful, and I've spent years trying to bury those memories. But it wasn't just the endless arguments that made our home unbearable. It was our father's rage, especially when he drank. I lost count of how many times I saw him hit our mother, the belt in his hand like a weapon. Some nights, he'd lock her in the bathroom for hours, refusing to let her out until morning. Mom did everything she could to protect us. When she knew he was coming home in one of his moods, she'd wake me up and quietly tell me to lock my door, to take care of Christine, to keep her safe. And I did. I'd wrap my arms around her, whispering promises that we'd be okay, even though I was just as terrified. Those nights stretched on endlessly, leaving behind scars that never really faded. The family dynamic. One of the most difficult things about living with my father was his ability to flip between being a complete monster one moment and pretending like nothing ever happened the next. After a night filled with drunken violence, he would wake up the following morning acting as if everything was perfectly normal. He'd go about his day, speaking to us as if he hadn't been screaming, hitting, or locking my mom in the bathroom just hours before. It was infuriating. If my mom ever tried to confront him about his actions, the yelling, the beatings, the way he treated us, he would either blame the alcohol or outright deny that any of it had even happened. He'd come up with excuses like, "I don't remember," or worse, "I don't think I acted that way." And if she ever dared to bring up the idea of divorce, he'd suddenly shift gears, spewing empty promises about how he was going to change. He would swear up and down that he was done drinking, that things would be different, that he would never hurt her again. But it was all a lie. It was just part of his manipulation, a cycle that repeated itself over and over. Another drunken night, another violent outburst, another morning of denial. For my mother, I can only imagine how heartbreaking it must have been to hold on to even the smallest shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That maybe he really would change, only to be crushed every time when the cycle started all over again. If you're wondering whether my father had some kind of mental illness that made him act this way, I wish I could say yes. At least then, we might have had some explanation, some clarity, maybe even a way to make sense of what he put us through. But the truth is, there was no diagnosed condition behind his actions. He wasn't sick. He wasn't suffering from anything that could justify years of abuse. He was just cruel. He was manipulative, narcissistic, and he thrived on having power over others, especially over my mother. It wasn't about mental illness. It was about control. The breaking point. I think the moment that finally pushed my mom to leave him, the point where everything shattered, was the night he raised a hand against me. She had endured so much, but when it came to us, her children, she had a breaking point. And that night, he crossed it. It happened when my mom had to leave town for a few days to attend her mother's funeral. She couldn't take Christine or me with her because we had school, and she didn't want us to fall behind. Before she left, she sat my dad down and pleaded with him to stay sober while she was gone, just 2 nights. That was all she asked. It was her mother's funeral, after all, and she had enough on her plate without having to worry about us on top of everything else. My dad, of course, had no interest in going with her. He begrudgingly agreed to stay home and take care of us. But the very first night she was gone, he came home drunk. I was fast asleep when he barged into my room, reeking of alcohol, his speech slurred. He was shouting, demanding to know where Mom was, clearly too intoxicated to remember that she was at the funeral. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to keep my voice steady, explaining that she was away. But he wasn't listening. He was stumbling around, knocking things over, kicking furniture, completely out of control. I was terrified that he would wake Christine, who was sleeping beside me. I swallowed my fear and, in the calmest voice I could manage, asked him to lower his voice and leave the room. I told him he was scaring me, but that only made things worse. That seemed to set him off completely. He exploded in rage, screaming at me for daring to tell him what to do in his own house. He ranted about how he could be as loud as he wanted, how I had no respect for him, how I was just like my mom, always defying him. I could see the fury taking over, and I knew exactly where this was headed. I tried to stay calm, to defuse the situation, but it only fueled his anger. Before I could react, he lashed out. The slap came out of nowhere, hitting me hard across the face. The force knocked me off balance, and I fell to the floor, clutching my cheek. Christine, who had woken up from all the shouting, started sobbing. She clung to me, her tiny body trembling with fear. My own heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I was terrified, but I also knew that if I froze, if I just sat there and did nothing, things would spiral even further out of control. Dad was on the edge of completely losing it, and I couldn't let him hurt us, especially not Christine. In that split second, I made a decision. I grabbed her hand, yanked her to her feet, and ran. We bolted out of the house as fast as we could, Dad stumbling behind us, still shouting, his words slurred from the alcohol. My only thought was get somewhere safe. And I remembered what Mom had told me in moments like this: go to the neighbors. They were the only people close by, and I knew we needed help immediately. I sprinted to their door, my heart racing, and started pounding on it, ringing the doorbell over and over. I must have looked like a complete mess, crying, shaking, desperate, but none of that mattered. When they opened the door, they didn't even hesitate. They had seen glimpses of our life before, the yelling, the chaos. They had heard my dad's drunken outbursts through the walls. And now, looking at us, they didn't need an explanation. They ushered us inside immediately and called my mom. We also called the police. When Mom picked up, she must have heard the panic in my voice because she didn't ask questions. She just said she was getting on the next flight home. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of relief, knowing that help was coming. Our neighbors reassured me that I had done the right thing, that getting away from Dad had probably saved us from something even worse. And as much as I wished none of it had happened, I knew they were right. That night changed everything. It was something I would never forget. The aftermath. When Mom came back and learned what had happened, she broke down in tears, hugging me tightly as she sobbed. She had endured years of abuse, but seeing it directed at her child was something she could no longer accept. It was as if something inside her snapped. That was the moment she decided, once and for all, that she was leaving him for good. Child Protective Services got involved, and my mom had to step in to assure them that from that moment forward, Christine and I would be living with her. My dad packed up some of his belongings and moved out while my mom started the process of filing for divorce. During this time, Mom apologized to me constantly. Over and over again, she told me how sorry she was for not leaving sooner, how she regretted not getting us out of that situation before it escalated to this point. I never blamed her for what happened, but I know she still carries the weight of that guilt. Even after everything, Dad didn't just disappear. True to his manipulative nature, he kept calling my mom repeatedly, even after she had filed for divorce, begging her to reconsider. And when she wouldn't budge, he started targeting me instead. Sometimes, he would insist on speaking to me, trying to guilt trip me over everything that had happened. "You're the reason this family fell apart," he would say, placing the blame entirely on me and Christine for running out that night and calling the police. As if we were the problem. As if wanting safety and peace was something to feel guilty about. Even after the divorce was finalized, he refused to let go. He constantly reminded us that he was still our father, that no matter what, he would always be a part of our lives, whether we wanted him to be or not. The thought of ever being near him again terrified me. I prayed every night that I would never have to live with him again. Thankfully, when it came time for the court to decide, the judge listened to us. They granted my mom full custody, a massive relief in itself. But even more than that, they issued a restraining order against my dad, legally barring him from coming near us due to the years of abuse we had endured. That ruling changed everything. For the first time in a long time, we could finally breathe. Christine, Mom, and I finally had the space to heal, free from the fear and chaos that had overshadowed our lives for so long. Of course, things weren't perfect. Living with Mom had its own challenges, and she had her own struggles. She had just lost the man she had spent years with, our father, and even though she knew leaving him was the right choice, it didn't erase the emotional and psychological wounds he had left behind. On top of that, she now had the enormous responsibility of raising 2 kids alone while also trying to find a stable job to support us. It was overwhelming, and watching her go through it all on her own was incredibly hard. One small relief was that the court ordered my dad to pay child support for both Christine and me. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. One less burden for my mom to bear as she tried to rebuild our lives. A few years after the divorce, my mom started dating again. His name was Felix, and he worked with her at the restaurant. From the beginning, he was always there to help her out. He asked her out multiple times, but she kept turning him down, until one day, she finally said yes. I'll never forget the way she looked when she came home from that first date, beaming with excitement, a lightness in her step that I hadn't seen in years. That's when I knew she was finally moving on. One thing that stood out about Felix was that he was noticeably younger than my mom, and I think that made her feel a little self-conscious. I remember asking her about him once, and she immediately looked embarrassed, almost as if she was expecting judgment. But from my perspective, I didn't care about the age difference. I was just happy for her. After seeing her break down in tears so many times during her marriage to my dad, feeling trapped in an endless cycle of pain and toxicity, it was a relief to finally see her smiling again. While I've always been supportive of my mom and her relationship with Felix, Christine has had the complete opposite reaction. In fact, she absolutely hates Felix, and not because he's ever done anything wrong to her. Her resentment comes from the fact that our mom moved on and chose to be with someone else. For some reason, Christine has always clung to this twisted, idealized notion that our parents were meant to be together, that they were soulmates. No matter what happened between them, she believed that, given enough time apart, they would eventually reconcile. She fully expected that one day, they would reunite and our family would be whole again. I've thought a lot about why Christine feels this way, and honestly, I blame our dad. He planted these ideas in her head. Even though I've had little contact with him over the years, Christine continued to visit him occasionally after the divorce, whenever he made time for her. It wasn't often, but when she did see him, it was clear that he used those moments to manipulate her. He would tell her that he was changing, that he was working on himself for the sake of our family, and that, in time, he and Mom would find their way back to each other. So every time Christine came home after seeing him, she would be filled with hope, convinced that one day, the 4 of us, her, me, Mom, and Dad, would be a family again. It was hard to listen to because, deep down, I knew it was never going to happen. I tried reasoning with her, explaining that there was a very good reason why Mom and Dad would never get back together, but she wouldn't hear it. In her mind, Dad still loved Mom, and no one else deserved to be with her. But as time went on, Christine was forced to face reality. Felix became an increasingly important part of Mom's life, and it became undeniable. Mom had moved on, and that realization shattered Christine's illusion. That's when her hatred toward Felix really took root. Years ago, Felix and my mom finally got married. Watching her go from a place of deep sadness and trauma to a life of happiness and stability has been incredible. Felix has been a constant source of support, not just for her, but for me and Christine as well. Despite Christine's feelings toward him, he's always been there for us whenever we needed him. He's a good man, and seeing my mom happy after everything she's been through is more than enough proof that she made the right choice. The wedding incident. Earlier this year, when Christine got engaged to her college sweetheart, she told me she was planning to invite our dad to her wedding. The news completely caught me off guard. I hadn't seen or spoken to our dad in years, and honestly, I never understood why Christine continued to maintain a relationship with him. He had been abusive, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Yet for some reason, she remained attached to him. Still, it was her wedding. It wasn't my place to tell her who she should or shouldn't invite, so I kept my thoughts to myself. But then something happened that I couldn't ignore. When Christine sent out her wedding invitations, Mom called me, confused and upset. She had just received hers and noticed something strange. She wasn't allowed to bring a +1. She asked if I had the same restriction, but I hadn't. As far as I knew, every other guest was allowed to bring someone. The only exception? Mom. It was baffling, especially since Christine knew Felix wasn't just some casual boyfriend. He was Mom's husband. He had been a part of our family for years. Yet not only was he excluded from the invitation, but Mom wasn't even given the option to bring him as her guest. When Mom confronted Christine about it, things escalated quickly. Christine doubled down, saying that for the sake of her wedding, she wanted Mom to play along and pretend to be a happy family with our dad in front of her in-laws. She didn't care that Mom had remarried. In her mind, this was her perfect chance to force a picture-perfect reunion, one where our parents appeared as if they were still together. Mom was completely blindsided by this demand. She couldn't believe Christine was asking her to set aside years of trauma and heartache just to entertain a false narrative for the sake of appearances. After everything Dad had put her through, how could she possibly pretend to be his wife again? It was an unfair and deeply hurtful request. I stepped in, hoping to get through to Christine, to make her realize how unreasonable and selfish she was being. I reminded her that Mom had every right to be happy, that she had moved on from Dad and built a new life with Felix. But Christine refused to listen. Instead, she lashed out at me, accusing me of never liking our dad and even blaming me for their separation. That accusation cut deep. As her older sibling, I had spent my childhood protecting her from Dad's abuse. I had done everything in my power to shield her from his anger, his manipulation, and his violence. Yet here she was, rewriting history, turning me into the villain in her story. In the end, Mom stood her ground. She refused to attend Christine's wedding under such unfair conditions. After all the arguments, the emotional turmoil, and the impossible expectations Christine had placed on her, she knew she couldn't go along with it. Not when it meant betraying herself and her marriage to Felix. The wedding disaster. As for my dad, he did attend the wedding, but it was far from a pleasant experience. The moment he arrived, I could tell he was already drunk. The stench of alcohol clung to him, and his behavior was erratic, exactly as I had expected. I made a conscious effort to stay as far away from him as possible, avoiding eye contact entirely. Just being in the same room as him was difficult enough. I had no interest in interacting with him. Things went downhill fast when it was time for the speeches. Dad was supposed to give a few words congratulating the newlyweds, but instead, he slurred his way through an incoherent mess of a speech, thanks to the multiple glasses of whiskey he had already downed. It was humiliating to watch. I could see the discomfort on people's faces, and it became painfully obvious that inviting him had been a huge mistake. Aside from that disaster, the rest of the wedding went smoothly. But now, after the wedding, things have gotten complicated, especially with Christine's in-laws. They've started asking questions about our family, specifically about why Mom wasn't at the wedding. Since they've met her before and know how supportive she is of her children, I guess they're beginning to suspect that Christine did or said something to cause the rift. Instead of being honest with them, Christine has started spinning a different story, one that paints Mom in a bad light. She's been telling her husband's family that Mom chose not to attend the wedding, making it seem like she was indifferent and uninterested despite Christine's supposed multiple attempts to convince her to come. Of course, this is a complete lie. And now Christine wants me to back her up. She's planning a lunch with her in-laws after returning from her honeymoon and has asked me to be there. But not just as a guest. She expects me to support her version of events. She wants me to help convince them that Mom's absence was inexplicable, as if she had no valid reason for not attending. Christine doesn't want them to know the truth, that she had placed unfair and selfish demands on Mom, which ultimately led to the fallout. Instead, she wants me to cover for her and shift the blame away from herself. That's why I'm on Reddit today. On one hand, Christine is my sister, and I want to support her, especially as she starts this new chapter in her life. But on the other hand, lying to protect her only makes things worse. It doesn't fix anything. It just prolongs the problem and makes the situation even messier down the road. Christine's in-laws deserve to know the truth if they're asking, and I don't think I can be part of a charade that unfairly makes Mom look bad just so Christine can avoid taking responsibility. Update 1. Christine has always been embarrassed about Mom's relationship with Felix. Felix is younger than Mom, not by a huge age gap, but for some reason, Christine finds it inappropriate. She's never approved of their relationship and believes Mom shouldn't have married a younger man. But here's the kicker. Christine has never actually told her in-laws that Mom and Felix are married. Yes, her husband Jacob knows, but the rest of his family doesn't. Mom and Felix had a quiet courthouse wedding. No big ceremony, no public celebration, no photos plastered online. Because of that, Christine has been able to pretend that Felix isn't a permanent part of Mom's life. She's been carefully crafting this illusion for years, refusing to acknowledge Felix's role in our family. And now, with this wedding situation, she's going even further, trying to rewrite history to avoid accountability. Christine has even gone so far as to repeatedly ask Mom to never mention her marriage to Felix to her friends or in-laws, telling her how embarrassed and awkward it makes her feel. And Mom, being the patient and understanding person she is, actually went along with it. For years, she respected Christine's wishes, keeping Felix in the background whenever Christine asked, believing that eventually, she would grow up and let go of her discomfort. But everything changed when Christine refused to let Felix attend her wedding. That was the breaking point. Mom had already compromised so much just to accommodate Christine's feelings, but this demand crossed a line. After years of making herself smaller to keep Christine comfortable, she had finally had enough. She put her foot down, and honestly, I don't blame her. As for my dad, I've long accepted the fact that he never truly loved anyone but himself. If he had really loved Mom, he wouldn't have put her through the kind of abuse he did. Part of the reason Christine is still so stuck on this fantasy of our parents reuniting is because she doesn't remember everything that happened. She was much younger when it all took place, and her memories of that time are fragmented. Mom has always asked me not to bring up the past with Christine, to spare her from the painful details of what we endured. Because of that, Christine has only scattered memories of our toxic home life. She's been able to convince herself that things weren't that bad, that maybe Mom and Dad just had a rough patch like any other couple. But she couldn't have been more wrong. Update 2. Thanks, everyone, for your advice. After reading through your comments, I showed this post to Mom, and she finally agreed to sit down and have an honest conversation with Christine. Long story short, Mom laid everything out on the table. She showed Christine the hospital records, the divorce filings, the undeniable proof of the abuse she had endured at the hands of our father. Christine, who had spent years refusing to accept the truth, sat there in stunned silence. I could see it in her face. This completely shattered the illusion she had been holding on to for so long. For years, she had convinced herself that our family's problems weren't that serious, that maybe Mom and Dad just went through a rough time. But now, faced with hard evidence, she had no choice but to confront reality. She couldn't deny it anymore. However, Christine still tried to argue. She insisted that maybe Dad had changed after the divorce, that perhaps he wasn't the same person he used to be. She even urged Mom to give him another chance, at least as a friend. But by that point, Mom and I had had enough. We stood firm and told her the truth. If she truly believed Dad had changed and wanted to keep glorifying him in front of us, despite everything we had suffered, then maybe it was time we took a step back from each other. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a boundary. We were exhausted from hearing Christine idolize the man who had caused us so much pain. Christine was deeply offended. She hadn't expected us to be so direct, and she asked for some time to process everything. I understand why she feels hurt, but she needed to hear it. It's not that I want her to cut Dad out of her life entirely. She's entitled to have whatever relationship she wants with him. But what I do want is for her to stop worshiping him and let go of this unrealistic fantasy of bringing our family back together. Update 3. It's been months since my last update, and a lot has changed. Christine eventually came clean to her in-laws about the real reason Mom didn't attend her wedding. I think after learning the full extent of the truth, she finally realized that blaming Mom wasn't just unfair, it was damaging to their relationship. Admitting the truth must have been difficult for her, but she did it anyway. Once her in-laws understood what our family had actually been through, they were much more understanding about Mom's absence. Since then, Christine has taken a huge step forward. She apologized to Mom. And in true Mom fashion, she forgave her without hesitation. Mom even took the initiative to speak with Christine's in-laws, smoothing things over and clearing up any misunderstandings. For now, Christine has gone low contact with Dad. And honestly, it's been such a relief to finally see this whole messy situation settle down.